treated as given. When a particular term, like Hinduism, Islam, we think it's uncomplicated. There's nothing, we know what Islam is, we know what Hinduism is, we know what something else is. But so to treat a term or object as given means to posit it as an objective reality outside of history and context. Doing so enables us to escape the often complex historical contestation and even political maneuvering that has gone into establishing a definition of a term as normative, and thus therefore enabling us to speak of it in a complicated way. So behind every term there's a history, and it's important to know that history. So I offer these reflections because they directly bear upon the subject of the inquiry that concerns us today. A question that has often been posed: what has been or is the nature of the relationship between Hinduism and Islam? On the surface, again, this seems like an uncomplicated question, a question that many have tried to answer with varying conclusions in the last 2 centuries, particularly in the last 2 centuries, from British colonial administrators in British India, to Hindu and Muslim nationalists, to secularist Indians, to Western Orientalists and academics. But is this question an unproblematic one? Is it even a legitimate question? My contention, which will be elaborated, is that this question is indeed problematic. And not only that, but the very terms in which it is posed conceal centuries of multifarious historical interaction. In other words, the manner in which these terms, Hinduism and Islam, are posited, firstly enables the obscuring of a rich history of complex exchanges and what a particular scholar, Sela Khan and others have called contact zones between Islam and Hinduism. Contact zones between different religious, intellectual, and cultural traditions that came to be reified and objectified into the meta-categories of Hinduism and Islam. Secondly, it obscures the role of British colonialism and the environment that it established, which came about due both due to a deliberate policy to control, as well as a historical accident, and that British saw things a particular way and just imposed those kinds of ways of seeing things onto the South Asian context. So it obscures the role of British colonialism in bringing about the objectification of these relatively fluid religious traditions into bounded and what Karl Ernst calls corporate entities. So making a fluid tradition into a bounded, institutionalized, a fixed entity or a system. Therefore, what I want to attempt to do is not to offer an answer to the question about the relationship of Hinduism and Islam, but to rather to trace a history of this question itself. Trace a history of this question itself, and by doing so attempt alternate understandings of these objects of Hinduism and Islam, and specifically their relationship designated in the question, and see how and why these came to be understood in the manner that they are popularly understood today. So how has the relationship of Islam and Hinduism been represented in the public sphere in the recent past and in the contemporary period? An example, perhaps now academically outdated, but still very reflective of popular discourse in South Asia and the Western media, is proffered by a man who was once called the doyen of the study of South Asian Islam in the West, Aziz Ahmed, who passed away in 1978. Though he's best known for works on South Asian Islam, he composed after moving to England and then later to Canada. He was educated in England during the years of the Raj. And his perspective was very much a product of the colonial era, as is evidenced in the typology he uses in his works for describing the relationship of Islam and Hinduism. His perspective, which I'm just using as an example, I could have picked many other people, but his example is useful because he talks about something which is very strongly popularly believed, but in academic language, which has had more influence and significance. So his perspective situates Islam and Hinduism in a relationship of perpetual antagonism throughout history, in which religious conflict is seen as proceeding from a natural opposition of these religious traditions to one another, and not because of various historical reasons, but it's just natural that when Muslims and Hindus get together, they're bound to fight or bound to be in antagonism in some kind of way. It's also very significant for illustrating how European ideas about South Asia, introduced there during colonization, were given a new lease on life through South Asians, through being adopted, sometimes creatively by South Asians himself, as Aziz Ahmed is of Indian origin. So in his works, it was one of his most influential works, Studies in the Islamic Culture in the Indian Environment. Aziz Ahmed gives a historical exposition. Aziz Ahmed gives a historical exposition of Hindu-Muslim relations when imagined through the lens of perpetual hostility, citing many an Orientalist and missionary from British India. In the introductory section, which is called Conflicting Nature of the Two Cultures, of his chapter of this book, he quotes from an American Orientalist and Methodist missionary, Titus Murray. For 12 long centuries, Islam has been in contact with Hinduism in India. For 12 centuries, each community has been confronted with the other. Their differences of belief, together with communal aspirations on the one hand, contending with an instinct for communal preservation on the other, have been the source of much friction, which continues to the present day. Aziz Ahmed's immediate gloss on this is that, quote, "This is on the whole an understatement," end quote. Then he adds that the whole history, again, this is a quote from him, whole history of medieval and modern India is to a very considerable extent a history of Hindu-Muslim religio-cultural tension. And this is something that it's not only Aziz Ahmed believes. I think large amounts of people in Pakistan, in India and beyond have a similar perspective. So he says that the history of medieval and modern India is a history of Hindu-Muslim religious cultural tensions, which have been punctuated on occasion by individual efforts at mutual understanding and harmony, but in which, however, the divisive forces have been much more dynamic, much stronger than the cohesive ones. Ahmed continues with a quote from another British Orientalist, F.W. Thomas, that Islam is the very antithesis of Hinduism. A claim that he then painstakingly details, and this goes on for a whole chapter, with reference to all manners of oppositions between Hinduism and Islam. The binaries, for example, he suggests, quoting many sources, European and South Asian, include the myriad philosophical and mystical expressions of Hinduism versus the austere rigor and adherence to God's word in Islam, a psychology geared towards the concrete and iconographic versus one that is atomistic, abstract, geometrical, and iconoclastic, the ability to assimilate new ideas, new gods, and other faiths versus the inability to adopt or compromise. And in this, each one, the Hinduism is the first of the binary and Islam is the second. Openness to the other versus religious cultural insularity, a spiritually and materially hierarchical view of religion versus religio-social egalitarianism, traditional versus revelatory religion, natively Indian versus foreign, belonging to India versus belonging to the Ummah, concerned with what is true versus concerned with what is right, emphasizing religion as private versus emphasizing incorporation in the collective body of the faithful, and so on. So a lot of these you can probably pick up are gross generalizations in many ways. They have some truth in them. It's not and that. But at the same time, there's a lot of generalization going on. There's a monolithic view of these traditions as completely representing what one has, the other one doesn't have, and vice versa. So an aspect of Ahmed's analysis that is revealing is his methodology, and which is based on direct reference to people like Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee, who are European historians who classified civilizations as units or organisms, in the case of Spengler, that were indicative of particular genius that was then manifested in all the specific cultural characteristics of that civilization, including religion. An implication of this perspective is that civilizations and religions are seen as self-enclosed units, which are mutually exclusive, and do not admit of admixture or change. Any change comes to be seen as corruption of the ahistorical essence of the entity in question, and therefore deviation from orthodoxy or from the normative perspective. So the influence of this schema in South Asia itself cannot be overemphasized. A couple of examples illustrate this. Muslim nationalism in South Asia, which leads to the two-nation theory and the creation of homeland for South Asian Muslims, Pakistan, is a direct consequence of viewing Hinduism and Islam as completely autonomous and mutually opposed cultural and religious units. You can even, some of the quotations from Jinnah Sahib himself mention this. But even more strongly, the rise of the Hindutva movement in India, which champions India as a Hindu country, based on really an Orientalist reimagining of a golden age Hinduism, which was destroyed by the arrival of marauding Muslims, were these foreign barbarians. Again, a very Orientalist view that was taken from British colonialism, and who are seen as foreign even if they be of Indian origin and have lived there for centuries, is a case of another case example of this idea of perpetual antagonism between Hinduism and Islam. So to finish this section off, so simply stated and contrary to popular opinion, the very idea that there exist two autonomous religious units and identified with the civilizations they spawned, and furthermore that these are in mutual opposition due to their essential natures with the resultant historical conflict, is a construct of 19th century British colonialism. This idea doesn't exist before that. No Muslims, Hindus, anybody else was talking like this. Prior to then, we'll talk a little bit more about that. To speak of Hinduism and Islam and a Hindu-Muslim conflict in the context of South Asia prior to the 19th century is to speak anachronistically. No doubt there are practitioners of various Indian religious traditions who later came to be amalgamated into the category of Hindu, and Muslims of various persuasions and perspectives, but there was no Hinduism and no Islam in the way that we use these terms today as these two bound traditions that are mutually opposed. So Hinduism and Islam in South Asia therefore are discursively largely products of the 19th century. At least this terminology is the product of the 19th century. Not that, there was obviously Indian traditions, Muslim traditions, and so on. To look for the beginnings of a Hindu-Muslim conflict in South Asia, one need not go back to the beginnings of Muslim presence in South Asia, as is the want of both Hindu ideologues as well as Muslim nationalism, and for a long time even Western academics, but merely to colonial British India. That's where it begins. So in the next section, I want to look at the prehistory, or the history of Muslims, Hindus, and religious identity in South Asia prior to British colonization, and then finish it up with a short discussion of how the British constructed these categories.